outset, the title of this panel is Modernizing the Instruments of American Power. I'd like to start from where we are, and hopefully this panel will start to talk about how do we get to where we should be. We've seen the disjointed efforts of the Bush administration to secure the country, and we have to start making a case that it's time to state a progressive alternative that is actually better at securing the country. In part, this conference is a very wonky discussion about progressive foreign and national security policy, but it's also, we have to show the country that our vision is more effective. The litany of critiques is very well known. The Bush administration has stretched thin our military forces, stubbornly refused to negotiate with countries that pose strategic challenges, that is, at least before they figured out that it might have some merit, have betrayed the basic American values to justify torture and unwanted domestic spying, and has misunderstood that economic assistance shouldn't overly rely on military assistance, and we've alienated Arab publics that spawned the 9/11 operatives. I think this topic of modernizing the instruments of American power really goes along two planes. The first is that we have discrete instruments and tools at our disposal. We have to bring those up into the 21st century. We have to take where we've been at during the Bush administration and make sure that they're applicable to face the 21st century challenges we face. The second aspect of it, which I alluded to briefly, is that we have to figure out how to make these work together. We have to figure out that, I hesitate to use the word, but we have to figure out how synergy works best when projecting American power. It might be something that's drawn from, American business world or something, but unfortunately, for the cliched term, it is applicable in this circumstance. Our tools have to be capable of identifying, prioritizing, and addressing immediate and long-term threats. Whether we're using special forces to raid Al-Qaeda caves on the Afghan-Pakistan border, checking the rise of potential near-peer military competitors, engaging Arab publics to present the United States as a more honest broker of Middle East and Arab affairs, or updating the traditions of liberal internationalism to build up state institutions and show that America and the world has a place together in a world economy. I'd like to lead off with a quote by Secretary Gates, as was mentioned several times by both Senator Bai and the panelists immediately before me. And he said, when it comes to America's engagement with the rest of the world, it is important that the military is and is clearly seen to be in a supporting role to civilian agencies. What the Pentagon calls kinetic operations should be subordinate to measures to promote participation in government, economic programs to spur development, and efforts to address the grievances that often lie at the heart of insurgencies and among the disconnected from which terrorists recruit. I'd like to lead off this panel with T.X. Hammes. You've just written this paper for the PPI. I'd like you to give us a rundown of what the end state of America's military in the 21st century should be, and how we have to get there. What sort of guiding principles do we need, and studies that lead us to the final end state of where 21st century American military should be?
Okay, the end state should be a medium weight force that's capable across the spectrum. And I'll tell you why I think we need to get there. One of the problems we've had is from 1990 all the way till about 2006, we were focused on the concept of network-centric warfare, and that we would have absolute information dominance. We would use our technology to totally dominate the battlefield. Now that's interesting, because at the time we were in three wars, Iraq, Afghanistan, and the global war on terror, and we didn't know what the hell was going on in any of them. But we were building a future force based on the idea we would have perfect knowledge. That is almost the definition of insanity. So we've got to get to a force that doesn't think it's going to be dominant through high technology, but rather is balanced across the spectrum. Why does it have to be balanced across the spectrum? Well, one of the key things is looking at what is the real threat out there. The real threat ranges today from active insurgency and terrorism up through the mythical, much-loved near-peer competitor. Much loved particularly by defense industry. We desperately need a near-peer competitor to justify some very expensive systems. The only one we throw up for that is China. The Pentagon itself has said China will be unable to project power in any significant way for a minimum of 10 years, probably a minimum of 20 years. So we have this strategic pause of about 20 years to rethink. And within that, we then have to move toward this balanced force. The other new enemy, and a couple of people have mentioned it now, is the super-empowered small group. They talk mostly about biological and cyber threats, but that's really about a super-empowered small group, particularly biology. Dr. Venter, who sequenced the human genome, led the team that did that, has stated categorically that within 10 years, a college student in a well-equipped laboratory for under $20,000 will create smallpox. That has an enormous impact. We have to start thinking about that. When we take advantage of this strategic pause, we squandered the first decade with this mythology of network-centric warfare and perfect knowledge. War just doesn't work that way. So if we look at the potential nation-state threats, we look at China, and again, I've already said it's a couple decades away. We look at Iran, and Iran's only real threat is to the world supply of oil. Iran itself is not a big threat. If it throws a nuke or two nukes in a few years, we dealt with nations that had thousands of nuclear weapons. And the sanity of their leadership was not that much off from Ahmadinejad. And they had absolute control of the countries they were running. So Iran is a threat primarily to the oil. And this is one of the few places in the world that we can count on the entire industrial world coming together to help. If Iran decides to close the Straits of Hormuz, I'm willing to bet the entire industrial world lines up with us on this one and helps us solve it. The third area is Russia. Nukes make it dangerous. And a lot of people want to point to its invasion of Georgia that's really expansionist. Look at how its power has recovered. This was a power projection exercise. They spent an entire summer preparing for it. They had to project power a grand distance of 90 miles against what was fundamentally a disorganized rabble. This doesn't sound like a threat. Because remember, they're starting from 900 miles east of where they used to be. So they've managed to project power 1/10 of the distance that would take them to the inter-German border. So I think we've got a real myth that there's this near-peer competitor that we have to spend huge amounts of money for. That gives us a strategic pause to skip a generation of weapons. Rather than procuring the very expensive F-35 system, say, couldn't we wait, count on the F-22s to keep us safe from surprise, and then wait and develop the unmanned aircraft which are coming next, which everyone agrees are coming next. Similarly, for some of our ground systems, we've got some very expensive systems we're trying to buy, when in fact we could probably stretch those out or not buy them. The problem is, of course, that requires reforming the Pentagon and our entire procurement system. So what we want to get to is medium-weight force. But above all, what we need, and this is a very short-term thing, and I would hope would be accomplished within the first 6 months of any new administration, is a strategy. We do not have a national security strategy. For the first time in 7 years, in the last couple of months, the Secretary of Defense and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff have put out a national military strategy and a national defense strategy. We don't have a national security strategy which involves all the instruments of power. We desperately need that. Why? Well, one of the things that might guide us, and this is where I'm going to disagree with the earlier speakers, everybody wants to send more troops to the good war, Afghanistan. No one is explaining to me what the hell these people are going to do. We have already sent 3 additional brigades in the last year, not U.S. brigades. But the British force has come from a force of under 2,000 to this rotation going in September. They will have 8,500 man brigade. The next rotation will be 9,000 men. So 6,000 additional people, 6,500 additional people, equivalent to 2 U.S. brigades. We've also put in a Marine Expeditionary Unit and an infantry battalion. That's another 3,000. So we put in the equivalent of 9,000 more people in the last year, and we've had no effect. The situation has gotten worse. So why do we think throwing in suddenly 2 more brigades will make a difference when you don't have a strategy? One of the reasons I say we don't have a strategy is we are bombing Pakistan to stabilize Afghanistan. We are bombing one of the most populous nations in the world, 170 million people, who have nuclear weapons and are having tremendous internal problems. We're bombing them so that we can save a country of 30 million people that is isolated from the entire world. And oh, by the way, all the bad guys who went to drive out of Afghanistan now live in Pakistan. If we had some type of a coherent strategy, we wouldn't be making decisions, knee-jerk decisions like that. It really kind of bothers me that both parties are pushing this more troops for the good war without any thought about what that is. So we've got to develop a strategy, then we've got to work our way through to a medium-weight force. I'll leave it there.
Okay, thanks. Well, we'll certainly come back because I think that there are some interesting points that you've raised, and I think that our co-panelists will no doubt take issue or offer some support. I'd like to move next to Derek, and I'd also like to start the conversation with you based on a quote that you and Jim Goldgeier wrote in your book, which is, although 9/11 created the illusion that America's purpose it was once again clear, this time combating Islamic extremism rather than fascism or Soviet communism, the questions America grappled with in the first decade after the Cold War remain unanswered. When should the United States use force to solve problems? When does it need to work through the United Nations to ensure legitimacy for its actions? Should it care that others perceive American goals as selfish? Will it promote free trade as jobs move overseas? Should it make democracy promotion a central part of its foreign policy? How much should it care about what happens inside other states? Debates over these issues continue to rage. I'm going to guess that most people in this room know their answers to those questions, and that perhaps in this room there's not so much a debate on how we should, on the answers to those questions. But I'd like you to build this bridge. TX has talked about revamping the military in a way, and then also engaging in this national strategy. No doubt that the second pillar of American power lies in our civilian capacities to execute a lot of the answers to these questions. It's no secret that the Bush administration has either ineffectively used our civilian capacities or hasn't used them at all. How do we bring them up to face the 21st century threats that we have?
That's a good question. You know, one thing that's sort of interesting is that, and I agree with TX's point about the sort of strategic pause that many believed we took during the 1990s, that sort of in the political frame about hard power, much of what TX has talked about, and soft power, although technically it's not soft power as Nye meant it to be, but basically the civilian side of our power toolbox, was that, you know, it was conservatives and Republicans who were sort of more comfortable with hard power. That was what really they believed national security policy was about, and that liberals and progressives really, you know, were nervous about the military side of things, and it was really only in the civilian areas that they were comfortable talking about or sort of talking about the use of U.S. power about. And that was seen as soft, and that was seen as weak. And it was, the idea was sort of real men didn't do, you know, soft power. And I think one of the healthy things that has happened in the last 7 years, and in many ways it's happened because of great tragedy and disaster, so it's been a negative lesson, but it's nevertheless, I think, positive overall for the sort of future of U.S. national security policy, is that there is greater appreciation within the strategic community, and actually even within the political community, about the importance of the civilian side and the civilian tools of the U.S. national security toolbox. You know, it's important that many sort of policy wonks in think tank land and you know, folks on Capitol Hill are more engaged in thinking about how we strengthen the civilian toolbox. I mean, in the last 3 or 4 years, there has been at least 20 major either think tank or congressionally mandated efforts to think about ways to strengthen civilian capacity. And I think that's a very positive thing. And it's actually, by the way, also bipartisan. You know, Secretary Gates' comments have been mentioned several times already this morning. I mean, Secretary Gates made at least two very important statements, a speech at Kansas State, a speech here in Washington a few months ago, talking about how important it is that we do get the civilian side of our house in order. Folks in uniform and folks recently out of uniform are also very strong advocates for strengthening our civilian capacity around the world, because it has been the U.S. military that has found itself taking on missions that are more traditionally considered civilian-type missions, development-type missions, whether in Iraq and Afghanistan or elsewhere. So I think that this greater awareness that this is important is a positive development. Now the question is how you build on it. I think one of the sort of consensus points that many of these studies have come up with is that the next 100 days, or the first 100 days of the next presidency, or the first year of the next presidency, regardless of who wins, is going to be a critical moment for any major decision and major policy move on strengthening civilian capacity. And the question I think that we're going to face is what that's going to be and how you actually do it. Because although we've had this kind of intellectual consensus growing around the idea of strengthening civilian capacity, the questions of what you're really going to do about it and what sort of trade-offs you're willing to make about strengthening our civilian agencies, whether it's pouring more resources into them or fundamental reform of our government, that's when the rubber hits the road. And that's where the debates and divisions really become apparent. Now, it's not just a resource issue. I mean, it is true that, particularly since 9/11, we've had one, part of our government, the Pentagon, sort of be boosted with steroids, and the other parts of our government, the civilian agencies, sort of go on life support. And that's a resource issue. But it's not just a resource issue. I mean, we have doubled our international affairs budget since 9/11. The question is really where you're going to put those resources. And it seems to me that there are several sort of challenges that we're going to face moving forward as we think about how to implement an effort to create greater civilian capacity. One is a question of sort of the stovepiping of the reform ideas that have come up. Typically, we have folks either focusing more on public diplomacy or the development mission or the stability operation mission, and the question is kind of how you integrate those in a whole. And that's a challenge because, in many ways, what they're trying to do, they come from different cultures. There are different budget authorities turf that folks are trying to protect. But you see much of the reform effort that have been talked about so far in the last 2 or 3 years, they're still within those stovepipes. And the question is kind of how we break down those stovepipes moving forward. The second sort of fundamental issue is greater institutional reform versus more specialized reforms. I think what we've seen in the last 6 or 7 years under the Bush administration is really more of an effort in specialized reforms. You create a small office within the State Department to deal with stability operations. You try to reform foreign assistance, but you're really sort of tinkering by creating a new, Deputy Secretary of State level person within the State Department. Or you create a sort of a government program to deal with HIV/AIDS, but it's sort of outside the normal structure of our development agencies. So the question is whether you continue along that sort of piecemeal effort, or do you go for sort of a big bang institutional reform? Do you create a Department of Development like the British did about 10 years ago? Do you create what some have called a super State Department, in which you merge, you merge all these agencies into a super empowered sort of foreign ministry? There's also the question, I think, of reform of the Congress. Most of our discussions focus on the executive branch, but ultimately, when you can only go so far talking about executive branch reform when it comes to this stuff without running into congressional reform. And that's where we've seen a lot of resistance, not just on the civilian capacity side, but also obviously on intelligence reform issues, where you have the committee jurisdictions and certain legal restrictions in place that make it very hard for some of these civilian agencies in the field to actually do the mission they've been set out to do. And then lastly, I think, is how you translate this, what I would call elite consensus about strengthening civilian capacity with a deeper and more sustained political consensus to do so. Because ultimately this is going to involve trade-offs. And whoever the next president is, we're going to be entering an environment with great resource constraints on our budget. If Senator Obama wins, which I hope he does, we're going to have a big agenda on the domestic side that's going to require a lot of resources. And there's still going to be a sustained commitment needed on the military side to reset our force or also continue our operations in places like in Iraq and Afghanistan. And where you come up with the political consensus to make some of the hard trade-offs that are going to be needed, the hard choices that are going to be needed when it comes to greater resources or some of these tough reforms that many believe are required, that's going to take a lot of work from our leaders here in town.
I want to turn to these two guys in a second, but just to quickly follow up on a point that both of you touched on. TX talked about, we can't just dump a whole bunch of more troops in Afghanistan and get the job done. And obviously Derek has been playing this building up of civilian capacities. What's the right formula in Afghanistan if we can't talk about just troop levels? How do we more effectively bring in the civilian aspects of American power to help solve the problem and hopefully win this thing?
I think first you start, again, we don't have a strategy. What in the hell are we trying to do in Afghanistan? We went in there to get rid of Al-Qaeda, and they're not there anymore. So what are we doing? Are we building a nation that didn't exist before? If that's the goal, then it has some requirements. If that's not the goal, what are we doing there? And also, we always want to talk about Afghanistan in isolation. We need a regional strategy. The real question is, how do we maintain stability in Pakistan? If we lose Pakistan, we lose Afghanistan. Our supplies come through there. Anything that we're in Afghanistan for goes to hell if Pakistan comes apart. Pakistan is also adjacent to India, another somewhat important nation, which we seem to be ignoring because we're focused on Afghanistan. Let's get a regional strategy, put it in place, think through what it is we're trying to do. Can anyone in this room tell me what our strategy in Afghanistan is?
I'm going to ask you that question right now. What should our strategy in Afghanistan be?
It should be to look to stability for the region, and then how that provides for security for the United States. I'm a minority here, I suspect, but I don't think that Afghanistan is a great threat to us if it falls apart. It was because Al-Qaeda found a place to hide there. Well, they're out there over the border in Pakistan, which is actually a worse situation, more resources, better connectivity to the world than Afghanistan had. So if Afghanistan comes apart, the primary concern has got to be what's its impact on Pakistan. And we've got to start thinking about Pakistan. Pakistan just became a much harder problem. We're back to democracy that just elected a president that his own doctors are concerned about his mental health. And he's Mr. 10%. So we have an enormously complex problem in Pakistan, and yet rarely do we have Pakistani experts engaged in the discussion about Afghanistan.
I agree completely with that. And I think part of the reflection of the fact we don't have a strategy in Afghanistan, or we don't have a real sense of what we're trying to do, is that we're essentially playing whack-a-mole. And which means that we're using the military, as we should, to go after bad guys, right? But that's basically the sum total of what we've got right now. Now, one of the hard realities we're going to have to face, or we're facing already and we're going to continue to face, is that all of the hopes that many have for greater civilian capacity that I've talked about, we ain't going to see that come to fruition anytime soon. I mean, it's not going to be something that, the next president in the first 100 days will instantly be able to create the sufficient civilian capacity to do some of the missions, perform some of the missions the military has been performing, or that the military has not been able to perform, that we believe need to be able to be fulfilled in Afghanistan. So it may be for the short term we're stuck with the military in the lead in a place like Afghanistan, but I think absent that strategy, what we're going to see is sort of more of this piecemeal kind of muddle through, which I think ultimately doesn't get us anywhere.
Just to follow up on the 100 days comment, you talked a little bit about how it was this critical moment. Obviously, we're not going to be able to turn everything on a dime as soon as the next president gets into office, but what do you think are the maybe one or two most key aspects or key policy decisions that a new administration can make in that first 100 days to bolster civilian capacities and make right decisions in places like Afghanistan?
Well, I mean, I think, at least on the bolstering civilian capacity, I think the biggest decision that a new president's going to have to make right out of the gate is are you going to go for this sort of big bang solution and take that on? I think there's good reason to be cautious about something along the lines of trying to create a new cabinet agency for development, despite the fact that maybe in a perfect world that's what we want. But it seems to me that could open up a bureaucratic and political morass in the first 100 days that a new president, regardless of who it is, may not want to get into. It seems to me on Afghanistan, in terms of exactly what we do, I think I guess I disagree a little bit where there is with TX in that I do think we have a disequilibrium between, say, in Iraq and Afghanistan in terms of the amount of effort we got there on the ground. I agree. Too easily, politicians fall in the shorthand where they just say, well, we're just going to throw a couple more thousand guys in there and that will sort of fix it, but without really much of a discussion of what they will be doing in there. But I do think one of the next president right out of the gate will have to sort of address this disequilibrium between the resources we're using, not just on the military side, but even what civilian resources we've got between Iraq and Afghanistan, and I would hope to see greater balance.
I think that this is actually a halfway decent segue into my left-hand side here. I'd like to turn to Reza first, and we've talked about Afghanistan on sort of a micro level. What do we do in terms of civilian capacities and military troop numbers and things like that? But in some of your writing, you've talked about, America is caught in the middle of the civil war for Islam's soul. And the Bush administration has tried to win it, or at least change a little bit of the perception of America's motives by, with a lot of surface level spin, I guess. And I guess that's sort of being kind, with creating things like Al-Hurra, the High Magazine, and the Salwa Radio network that have all been based out of the State Department and have essentially been relatively, extraordinarily ineffective propaganda machines for the U.S. The battle for Islam's soul, if America is truly going to bolster moderate voices within it, how does America help change this narrative, this overall overarching narrative?
That's a good question, and I like how you put it, because the issue of narrative is really important. We've been, for the last 7 years, we've been asking this question: why do they hate us? Why do they hate us? And I think that a much more important question is, who the hell are they? That's the question that we have to start with, because what we have created in the narrative of the so-called war on terror is this imaginary enemy, this idea that there are these disparate forces throughout the Arab and Muslim world, some of which are transnational, some of which are national, Islamists and jihadists, groups as eclectic and diverse as Hamas in Palestine, or the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, or for that matter the clerical regime in Iran, or the Sunni insurgents in Iraq, or the Shia insurgents in Iraq. According to the dominant narrative of the war on terror, all of these disparate groups and organizations represent a single monolithic enemy with a united agenda, a single aspiration, and as a result, they require a single answer. And that answer is defined by the metaphor of war, hence the war on terror. The problem, of course, is that these are incredibly diverse, eclectic groups, many of which, obviously they have different goals and aspirations, but many of which even loathe each other far more than they loathe the United States. But what we have done is, by creating this, what is often referred to as an undifferentiated enemy, we have very clearly walked into the dominant narrative on the other side, which is that the war on terror is a war on Islam. It's very hard to argue against that, because frankly, it's kind of true. Certainly the war on terror is not against the Basque separatists in Spain, or the Mujahideen al-Cult, or the Christian insurgency in East Timor, or the Tamil Tigers, or the PKK. It's quite clear that when we talk about the rhetoric that we've used, this highly polarizing rhetoric that we've used to talk about this conflict, has been very much focused on the use of violence and militant radicalism in the Islamic world. So I think the important thing is precisely what Jim said, is changing that narrative. And I think the first step to changing that narrative is recognizing unquestionably that there is a military component to this conflict. There are militants, particularly these transnational groups like Al-Qaeda, and the larger social movement that Al-Qaeda represents, which is, I think, more properly referred to as jihadism. There is a military component to this. These are people with guns, with weapons. They are militants, and the only way to counteract them is through our military. And frankly, in some ways, we've done a marvelous job of doing so. But that's sort of the tip of the iceberg. The larger issue here is, how do we deal with not Al-Qaeda the entity, but Al-Qaeda the movement? Not how do we deal with the messenger, but how do we deal with the message itself? And that, I think, we've done a very poor job of confronting, for a whole host of reasons that we can get into during our discussions. But I'll focus just on one part of this problem, which isn't talked about too often. And that is the refusal, I think, in certain quarters of the United States government, both on the left and the right, to make a serious differentiation between those trans-nationalist religious organizations like Al-Qaeda who seek global transformation. These are utopian groups that have no interest in the creation of a nation state. In fact, think of the idea of a nation state as anathema to Islam and everything that they stand for, and who are connected to each other through these new technologies of globalization, whether they be satellite or internet or what have you. And religious nationalist organizations, or what we sometimes refer to as Islamists. Basically what I want to do is I want to make sure that everybody in this room understands that there's a difference between an Islamist and a jihadist. A jihadist is somebody with a global agenda. An Islamist is a nationalist, is somebody whose ideas, whose goals, whose ideology, whose aspirations end at the borders of their nation state. Now, of course, there's a whole host of different Islamist groups, from the most democratic groups like Turkey's AKP, groups that have forsworn violence in favor of democratic participation, like Algeria's Front Islamique, like Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood I would put into that category, Jordan's Islamic Action Front, to those groups who are still using violence in order to create a revolutionary change, like Islamic Jihad in Egypt, the GIA in Algeria, the Taliban, of course. What we have to recognize is that the impulse of religious nationalism is not that weird. It's a perfectly normal, and in fact, in a truly democratic society, inevitable idea that has to be dealt with. At the beginning of the 20th century, 1/2 of the world's population identified itself with one of the 5 major religious traditions. 100 years of secularism, of technological advancement, of nationalism, that number is now 2/3. People are becoming more religious whether you like it or not. And they want their religious ideals and their values to be a part of the political discussion of their societies. That's what religious nationalism means. And I think that if we get to the point where we can say, look, our enemy is not these religious nationalist groups. These groups can be co-opted. They can be given an opportunity, if they forswear violence, to have some effect in their societies. And frankly, they can evolve to responsible governance. And then we figure out a way to engage them, then we're going to have a much better job in this sort of war of ideas than we have been so far.
I want to pick up on a couple points. Interesting. I'm not sure how this is going to come out, particularly because we're talking about a progressive forum here, but the idea that religious nationalism is not that weird has certainly taken root in some circles within the United States.
Yeah, I mean, look, we're a nation in which 50% of our population designates itself as evangelical. And that a large percentage of that evangelical population describes itself as Christian nationalists. They want to press their moral and ethical values and ideals upon the society in which they live. Now, we live in a democracy, so we give those people an opportunity to join the marketplace of ideas. And then we allow the population to vote on those ideas, to essentially, comment on those ideas. In a society like, for instance, let's say in Egypt, where you have an organization that essentially has the same goals and same ideals as a large part of the Republican Party, to be honest with you. We do not, because we label them as Islamist, this sort of boogeyman word, Islamist, which means nothing more than just sort of political, Islam or Islamic religious nationalism. And we give in to what the United Nations has called a legitimacy of blackmail by falling for the completely false construct that Mubarak and so many other autocrats in that region give us, that, well, look, if it weren't for me, if it weren't for my anti-democratic, autocratic policies, then the crazies would take over. And the first thing that they would do is turn the country into Afghanistan under the Taliban. This is nonsense. This is absolutely nonsense. It has no basis in reality in the cultures and the societies that we're talking about here. But because the idea of state and Islam and religion and nationalism, these buzzwords that, particularly for progressives, give us heartburn, we tend to sort of fall into this trap. And what we've done over the last 50 years in propping up these dictators and in helping to stifle the voice of democracy and political participation, because it has a tinge of religion to it, is only radicalized these pious nationalist groups. If the only free society, if the only free space in your society is the mosque, which is the case in Jordan, it's the case in Egypt, it's the case in Saudi Arabia, our three closest allies in that region, then of course opposition is going to be religious opposition. I mean, it's crazy to think that it would be otherwise. I know we would all like to have a bunch of Jeffersons, sitting around in Egypt, planning some kind of, great liberal secular democracy, but it ain't going to happen. So we need to sort of be aware of what the reality is and work with it in that sense.
I'd like to point out that on this very distinguished panel, that's the second time the word "ain't" has been used. I'd like to talk a little bit, drill a little bit deeper on that point, where there's potentially an uncomfortable relationship between an American religious nationalism and this idea that promoting democracy abroad, particularly throughout the Middle East, is something that lessens the boiling point a little bit, that there is freedom of expression, but it's done through religious means. So how does this idea for progressive national security fit into an overarching narrative where we have to almost espouse the ideas that progressives are potentially uncomfortable with, about promoting the idea that we give evangelicals as much of a right to vote as everyone else, and then transferring that into an international message and narrative that we use to promote democracy abroad?
Well, I'll tell you how. We stopped using the word democracy, first of all. Like it or not, that word has become toxic. This administration has destroyed that word for that region. When you use the word democracy in Egypt, it means destabilization. In Palestine, it brings up the hypocrisy that we exhibited there by giving them, for the first time in their existence, the opportunity to pick their own leaders, and they chose anyone who was not the status quo, which in this case turned out to be Hamas, and we shut down the process completely. We talk about development. And if we're serious about promoting social and political and economic development in that region, then we have to understand that comes with it. It's inevitable. It's impossible to do without this. That what that allows for is for a large percentage of the population that for most of the last half century has been excluded from the political dialogue. It requires, it necessitates that group to have an opportunity to make itself heard. We've been functioning, for the most part, I mean, not really, but the idea of the Bush doctrine for at least a good 6-7 months there was that political participation has the power to moderate extremist tendencies. I think that has been proven over and over again, particularly in the Middle East. I think Turkey's AKP is a perfect example of this, as well as numerous other so-called Islamist political parties in Malaysia and Indonesia who have become part of the responsible governance of those states. But we also have to recognize that this is not going to be an easy thing. I mean, we have to sort of buckle down a little bit and say, if we're going to take this seriously, if we're going to take seriously what Condi Rice said in Egypt in 2002, which is the days of working for stability over democracy are over, if we mean that, then we have to understand that at least for a while, those oppositional groups in the region that are going to have a much greater say in the politics of these countries are going to be religious opposition groups, because there is no other opposition groups. They don't exist. If you're a liberal secular Democrat in Egypt, you're in prison. If you're a religious opposition leader in Egypt, then you're fine. You've got the space to preach. You've got the openness of society. If you go too far, you'll be taken care of. But nevertheless, we have to understand that when we say democracy promotion and socio-political development, it's impossible to think of those terms, those ideas, without including these religious groups, these religious parties, whether we like it or not.
Good. I want to turn Ed, who's been waiting patiently here for a few minutes to jump in on the discussion. As Reza was getting fired up, I figured I'd let him go for a few minutes. But I want to ask Ed about some of these things. We talked about democracy promotion and lessening, taking a pot away from the boiling point a little bit. You're a trade guy, and we've mentioned it a little bit in some of this morning's sessions as well. Stemming from the traditions of FDR and Truman, where the U.S. has had this great tradition of liberal internationalism, in the spirit of the Marshall Plan, progressives have engaged the rest of the world through this joint interest to align our goals, whether they be economic, democratic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Can you talk about, in maybe the context of a little bit of what Reza has said, about what a progressive administration needs to do in order to update this tradition of liberal internationalism?
Okay, that's a very good question. Let me make one observation on Reza's comments, though. There may be so many Christian nationalists in this country, but they cannot get the country to adopt a Christian religion as an official matter, and they cannot pass laws to say you cannot convert out of Christianity. There are pretty sharp limits in the Constitution and the law of the United States on how far they could go. And I think drawing a precise analogy between their views and Islamism in government can take us a little too far, maybe. But having made that observation, the progressive internationalist tradition, as developed by Wilson and Roosevelt and implemented by the Democratic presidents since, seems to me to have 5 basic pillars. One being strong national military service, another being alliances with democracies and friendly nations, a third being the development of international laws and institutions, as Peter Beinart was talking about, a fourth being the promotion of human rights and democracy, maybe not the right word anymore, but the concept of self-determination, self-government, and finally the view that economic development, economic integration among countries will both reduce the temperature and the political appeal of radicalism and give nation states more of a stake in one another's security and prosperity. So you could see in Wilson, one of his 14 points is reduction of trade barriers. One of the founding institutional innovations of Roosevelt and Truman was the creation of the IMF and the World Bank and the GATT system, which has now evolved into the World Trade Organization. When I think of our major security challenge today, which I think broadly is our relationship with the Muslim world, what I see is that we have not really adapted this last pillar of policy to this challenge. And in fact, we are retaining a lot of policies, or a number of policies, that make American trade policy in particular work against it. Let me point to 2 specific issues that I think the next president ought to address. One is development at a kind of mass level when we think of employment and growth and investment. And the other is development at an elite level when we think about who is going to be running the government institutions and businesses and medias of the Muslim world in the next 10 or 15 years. In the first sense, one thing that I feel we who worked in the Clinton administration didn't see closely enough, and the Bush administration hasn't done much on either, is that the Muslim world, with the exception probably of Turkey and Malaysia and maybe Albania, was the great economic loser of the globalization era. We think of 1980 to 2000 perhaps. During these years, which began basically with the collapse of the first oil boom, the Middle East saw its share of world trade fall by 75%, saw its share of world investment fall by almost 80%, to the point at which by the year 2001, there was more foreign direct investment going to Sweden than to all of the 30 countries of the Muslim world combined. Simultaneously, the population of these countries grew by about 250 million. I think anywhere in the world, if you are told that there will be a demographic boom, a huge surge of young men and women coming into teenagehood and adulthood, and a sharp contraction in the economy, you'll guess that this part of the world will produce anger and radicalism, and perhaps it will be focused on the United States, maybe for some historic reasons, maybe simply because we're the most visible power. This was, I believe, the economic and demographic background of Europe in the 1920s and 30s and of East Asia in the 40s and 50s. And I think many of the problems that we saw in those parts of the world grew out of this environment in the backdrop. We dealt with those issues, sometimes unsuccessfully, but basically on the whole, using trade, using alliances, and using economic assistance very successfully in Western Europe during the 40s and 50s, very successfully to reintegrate Japan and Germany into the world economy, fairly successfully to deal with the wars and upheavals in Southeast Asia over time, and same with Central America. I think we can take some of these principles and adapt them to the Muslim world today, but in fact we're doing sort of the opposite. If you take, for example, the leading export of Pakistan is towels. A single container full of towels puts about 500 Pakistanis to work. We have a tariff of about 9% on a Pakistani towel, and we have a tariff of 0% on a towel from Mexico, or from South Africa, or from El Salvador, or all those other countries that we have enrolled in free trade agreements and preference programs. So as we've been thinking about development and growth and job creation in the Muslim world, we've been evolving in part through maintaining tariffs in some areas, and in part through eliminating them for selected countries, a trade system that is pretty sharply tilted against Pakistan and against Bangladesh and against Indonesia and against Afghanistan and Iraq and Lebanon and Tunisia and a number of other countries which are important to us. I think the next president can easily, given some cooperation from Congress, even this out, and if not give those countries an advantage, give them parity with the countries that they're competing with. Second, at the elite level, U.S. universities are the world's main training ground for the elites of most developing countries. We have 500,000 students here every year. In the aftermath of the September 11th attacks, we made it much harder to get student visas. Since then, the number of students from Pakistan has dropped from about 9,000 to about 5,000. The number of students from Indonesia from about 11,000 to about 7,000. The number of Americans going to those countries to study is extraordinarily low. I believe there are 13 American students in Pakistan and 100 in Indonesia, and I'm sure you could get similar statistics for many other countries. So without really thinking much about it, we have significantly narrowed the ability for the elites of the next generation of Americans and of Muslim states to get to know each other and to get to understand the way they operate and what their values are and what's important to them. I think these are two areas that can be dealt with without a great deal of stress on the American system and can bring a lot of quick investment and job creation to countries where you have very high unemployment rates, and over the long term help to rebuild a cadre of elites in business and government and media and elsewhere in the Muslim world that know us and maybe don't always agree with us, but understand where we're coming from and know how to get their points across as well.
I'd like to press you on one point of clarification. When we talk about building up a stable, integrated economies throughout the Muslim world and Southeast Asia, there's a knee-jerk argument that's sometimes made that, one of our goals in doing this is that by lifting the base level population out of poverty, we're doing things like giving impoverished youths a sensible alternative for the rest of their lives. They can have careers instead of potentially turn towards Islamic extremism. The counterpoint to that is that the bombers on 9/11, the Madrid bombers, the London bombers, all came from relatively middle-class families that were relatively well-educated. In the case of Madrid bombers, I believe one of them had lived in Spain since 1986 and had a relatively middle-class family. I'd like you to be specific, and Reza, feel free to jump in as well, to state our goals in integrating these economies into the world, on the world stage, and how that also affects what we're doing in specific anti-terrorism policies.
Okay, well, I guess I would say two things. One is that the more you have growth and a sense of optimism in a country generally, the less appeal radical groups will have overall. You could look back 30 years or 40 years in time, think of Southeast Asia, Central America, the Middle East. A discussion like this would say those are three pretty troubled parts of the world. Southeast Asia, Central America have basically, through development, gotten over their internal troubles, or many of them. Their countries are pretty stable, their publics are not always happy, but not radicalized. And I think you have to look to that hope for the Muslim world as well. Second, and related to it, I think, I'm not by no means an expert, but my sense is that the Muslim countries see themselves as having a long and very proud history, see themselves as not the leading powers of today's world, feel humiliated and angry about that. And that is the type of thing that will drive a middle-class person whose life isn't so bad on the face of it into a sense that, our people are victims, our people are mistreated, our people have been trampled by the United States. I'm going to give my life for this, to rectify this injustice. And I don't think you can ever count on economics or student visas or any of those things as panaceas, I guess is the word, as cure-alls. But I think you can rely on them as valuable complementary policies. And I think you can also say, if we look at a military first or military only policy, and you can see that it's not getting us very far. So maybe economic development and trade and so forth won't help, but it's at least worth a try, because whatever else we're doing, it isn't all working all that well.
So do you think this is a case of, for actually all of you, I know Reza wants to jump in here, is this a case of the United States with its narratives and with its policies being only able to tinker at the margins when it comes to these sorts of ideas, or are there real benefits that civilian power can actually contribute?
Can I start by going back a little bit to your question and once again sort of emphasizing that there is a difference between a jihadist terrorist and an Islamist terrorist. Islamism, the kind of violent religious nationalism that we see in places like Egypt, in places like Jordan, does feed off of a sense of deprivation. It is appealing to the poor and the marginalized, and it must be combated through precisely the kind of socioeconomic development that Ed is talking about. That will not do a thing to change the problem of jihadism. The jihadists who attacked us in September 11th, or who attacked Madrid, or who have been rounded up throughout various parts of the world in trying to join this global movement, this global social movement that Al-Qaeda so clearly represents, of course they're middle class. Of course they're bright and educated. The best and the brightest are the kinds of people who think about global transformation. somebody living, in Gaza trying to feed his family couldn't care less about jihadist ideals of, utopian notions of a world without borders and boundaries and a return to a sense of, unadulterated religious communalism. This is important to them. So these are two different enemies with two different ideas, and they require two completely different responses. So yeah, the socioeconomic, that's important. It's not going to do anything to affect these jihadist groups, except it will take away, as Ed, I think, correctly hinted, it'll take away their audience, certainly, because the way that they advance their ideas, their notions, is by creating a narrative in which localized grievances, your inability to get a job, your lack of movement or freedom or human rights, are connected to global grievances, the war against Islam, etc., etc. If you address the local grievances, then you can take the bite out of that narrative, and in that sense it's important. And if I could just very, very quickly just say one more thing, I think it's a mistake I think the characterization of Christian nationalism that Ed gave is incorrect. According to Rice University, 45% of Americans want to make the law of God, biblical law, the law of the United States. It's not that Christian nationalists do not want to force their religious ideals upon the state. It's that they can't. It's that in a constitutional state, they're incapable of doing so. At the flip side of that, we hear so much in the Muslim world, particularly these oppositional groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, express their grievances, their ideas, their agendas in religious terms, because of course that is the language that holds the most currency with the masses, as anyone in the Republican Party can tell you. And yet immediately we label it as a theocratic movement or a theocratic idea. So what I mean to say is, we don't have a problem with, Tom DeLay standing on the floor of Congress and calling down the wrath of Jesus upon federal judges who disagree with him. That's okay. But if a member of the Muslim Brotherhood talks about social rights and civil rights in Islamic terms, then he's a theocrat. And we cannot allow him to have any political participation or heaven forbid any kind of political control, because the first thing he'll do is turn it into a Taliban state, as though that's what Egyptians want. Let's not fall into that false trap. It's just simply not true.
TX wanted to jump in there.
I think one of the things we've got to not do is focus too much on this threat. Even if you solve the economic problems of the world, there will be discontented people. And if 1/1000th of 1% of the people in the world are unhappy about a subject, that gives you a base of 60,000 people. The problem is, you used to have 60,000 isolated people. Now they've got the internet. So all the squirrels can find each other. So you got the problem of the squirrels can now assemble, plus the decreasing costs of massive destructive power, particularly bio. And because we have been almost totally inert on biodefense, we are extraordinarily vulnerable. When a guy with the prestige of Dr. Venter says within 10 years a college student can do this, and then say get 19 volunteers to ride airliners around the world, and you have an instantaneous worldwide outbreak of smallpox, which would be extraordinarily difficult, essentially uncontainable. The world comes to a halt for a period while we sort that out. And yet we are dedicating no resources to that, or pumping huge amounts of dollars into missile interceptors that we're not sure if they work. I'm not against developing anti-missile defense, but I think you should make it work before you build it.
Just I want to link together two thoughts from TX and Reza, which I think are important, and sort of also get to the politics of what we're talking about, which is what is it we're actually trying to do? Like, what sort of world are we in? And then how do we talk about it, right? And what's interesting is, after the Cold War, we had this, we were scrambling around, and forums like this were used to talk about, what is it, containment's gone, right? The Cold War is over. So what's the purpose of American power of the world? And many folks tried to come up with it unsuccessfully, right? 9/11 happens, and all of a sudden, the administration articulates a frame for how to think about the world we're in and how to use our power in it, and that's the war on terror as a frame. And I think, as you pointed out, that frame itself, just that language, the war language, the war on terror language, actually hurts us in the arena in which we're trying to play it, right, in the Middle East and elsewhere. It also skews how we try to go about combating it, which is it's a war. So it's sort of an over-militarization of how we are going about using our power and dealing with the extremist threats. But yet, at the same time, for progressives, there's a political impetus to sort of parrot that language because it's a fear of being seen as weak, when we have real threats out there, and there are genuine bad guys. Now, what's interesting is I think among kind of intellectuals and policy analysts, the war on terror as a frame or as a way to talk about it has been more and more discredited, particularly in the last few years. You have leading military officers saying that we shouldn't be calling it a war on terror. People like Colin Powell saying it shouldn't be a war on terror. Don Rumsfeld himself, when he was leaving the Pentagon, said, "I regret that we called it a war on terror." But the problem, of course, is then what do you call it? Because of course, what the threat we face and the challenges we face are very complex and require a level of sophistication across our government and frankly across our society that it's hard to encapsulate that in a single phrase or word. But yet I think the political impulse is to try to find that phrase or word, and particularly for progressives, the political impulse is to try to find the phrase or word that also cannot be twisted to connote weakness in how we're going about doing that. So I think that's a challenge as a political culture we sort of face moving forward as well.
I noticed Congresswoman Tauscher has just walked in the room. So before we turn it over to her, I do want to get one or two audience questions in real quick. So if anyone...
Hi, I'm Milt Wilkins, summer intern for Progressive Policy Institute under Jim. This question is for Mr. Aslan.
I haven't paid him to ask this question.
Thank you. I mean, as you're well aware, the traditional foreign policy hypocrisy of the U.S., backing dictators while simultaneously publicly supporting democracy, has killed or at least undermined our prospects for engaging a lot of these political Islamist groups, the moderate Islamists, who can pull people away from the terrorists, especially the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and especially through our Mubarak and Musharraf policies. But I was wondering what you thought, what were the current or future prospects for the U.S. actually engaging these groups, or whether we even needed to, whether we just needed to make their societies or do everything we could to make their societies open enough so that they could take over. And in that vein, in Pakistan's weakened regime state right now, with Musharraf out of play and the coalition frayed and fractured, what do you think the odds that moderate Islamism in Pakistan, and I'm not familiar with the groups there, you would be, sorry, would emerge and gain the clout necessary to indirectly serve a security interests?
It's a great question. Let's start with Pakistan, if you don't mind, because I think Pakistan is a great example of the misperception that we have about what's taking place there. Certainly, this is a fractured country. I mean, the political situation. I'm with Colonel Hamas on this. I have nothing good to say about Ali Zardawi. But what is not true about Pakistan is that there is some sort of fear of some kind of Islamist takeover of that country. In every opportunity that the religious parties in Pakistan have had to take part in national elections, even in those elections, like the previous parliamentary election that brought the PPI to power, PPP in power.
We're going to do it soon.
The wrong one.
Wishful thinking.
Brought the PPP
Will's a nice
into power. Even that, in which the religious nationalist groups managed to come together to form a single party, even then they did not manage more than 5% of the vote. So, which is why in my field, we sort of denigrate them as the 5%ers. Because they can never get, more than 5%. Sometimes they've reached about 7% or so of support. Because Pakistanis themselves, regardless of how pious they may be or how anti-Western they may be, do not want to live in a theocratic state. And yet, what we had done for the past 7 years in funneling $10 billion to Musharraf to essentially do nothing but to bolster his police state, we managed to make the grievances of these religious parties legitimate. In fact, I was having dinner with Will last night, and I brought up this historical example that for a while there, and I think we've avoided, but for a while there, Pakistan was looking a lot like Iran in 1977, 1978. You know, this dictator being propped up with billions of dollars of American funds, and in which the opposition groups, the secular liberal Democrats and the most theocratic, Islamist groups, were actually marching hand in hand, because it turns out that their grievances were aligned. And then, of course, after the revolution, the religious groups took over. So, again, I think that we have to be wary about making this much bigger issue than it actually is. On the flip side of that, what do we do? How do we engage these groups? Well, we do have our hands tied a little bit by political considerations here. Nobody is going to become president of the United States by saying, hey, let's talk to the Muslim Brotherhood. But at the same time, if we have a comprehensive agenda of social and political development in the region, one in which our aid policy it comes into play. For instance, we give Mubarak $2 billion and we let him do whatever he wants with that $2 billion. And what he does with that $2 billion is buy weapons from us. If the idea of making that aid even remotely contingent upon some institutional development, schools or hospitals, or allowing some of that money to trickle down to the numerous NGOs on the ground in Egypt who are actively working for the kinds of democratic developments that we would like to see, has never even crossed our minds. And yet it's something that has to be a part of a much more an overall agenda that seeks development over just simple stability, because it hasn't worked. 50 years of stability over political development hasn't gotten us anywhere. We're exactly as, if not worse off than we were before.
Does anybody else want to jump in on that?
Yeah, the question, when you said that we support oppressive regimes, it's worse than that. We also bomb democracies and cut off funds for democracies. The one, we keep saying Israel is our friend, the one functional democracy in the Middle East. When they choose to attack another democracy, either Hamas elected or the Lebanese democracy, we don't protest, nor did the Democratic Party stand up and protest. What we did was we rushed them more bombs. We air freighted extra bombs because they hadn't killed enough Lebanese, and that's the way we support democracy in the Middle East. What you do speaks so loudly I cannot hear what you say. We keep doing things that say we do not want to give you a chance. We don't want to give you a break. That eliminates the moderates, pushes people to the extreme religious end, and then you get what you get.
Pretty definitive words there. I think we have time for maybe one more. If anyone else wants to jump up to the microphone, please.
Hi, Jim Warren. Trying to connect the dots a little bit, and keeping in mind Mao's phrase that insurgents are the fish that swim amongst the sea being the people. And I probably butchered that a little bit. And I'm trying to understand the difference between the relationship between Islamists and jihadists. How much is Islamism the gateway drug for jihadists? And if so, doesn't then the economic effects and the things we've been talking about kind of take away that cover for jihadism? Makes it much harder for that 60,000 off people to get as far in the planning as they have in the past?
I'll answer this very quickly because I'm talking too much, but that's a great way of putting it. I mean, globalization and the assault that it has had on national identities and the way that it has begun to erase borders and to really, particularly in the Middle East, in which those borders were arbitrary for the most part to begin with, and often drawn by other people, it has pushed nationalists, religious nationalists, who have been incapable of bringing their ideas, their aspirations, their notions of civil society to the table, to the transnationalist side. Al-Qaeda began as a religious nationalist organization. It grew out of Islamic Jihad, Zawahiri's organization in Egypt. The major ideological battle that is taking place right now is between Al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brothers. Loathe each other, hate each other, see each other as mortal enemies. And Al-Qaeda gets, its sort of core leadership comes from people that it has taken out from the Muslim Brotherhood, because its criticism of the Muslim Brothers is, look, you forswore violence, you said you'd give in to political participation, and what have you gotten? Nothing. Nothing has come of it. You're still illegal, you're still in prison. Join us in this global movement and forget about your nation. We'll tear down all nations. We'll recreate the planet. That's a pretty appealing message to a educated, middle class, pious, nationalist stinking away in a jail in Cairo. So it's absolutely a gateway drug. I always say that the antidote to jihadism is Islamism, whether we like it or not.
Anyone have any closing
Yeah,
comments?
can I add one?
Why don't I go to Ed first?
Just the country that I've visited most is Malaysia. It's quite a bit of ways from the Middle East. But there I think you can find a lot of support for Reza's way of thinking, in that Malaysia is a very stable middle-class society, very prosperous. It has a multi-party system, not entirely democratic, but one in which secular liberals and Islamists, known as PAS party, participate regularly, and seems to date to have been quite immune to the jihadism and the kind of terrorist virus that have infected other parts of the world that aren't doing quite so well.
Same with Turkey, I think is another good example.
I would do one caution on that. Mao's insurgent theory is based on a mass insurgency in a hierarchical society. War flows from a society it's part of. What we're seeing now in insurgencies is coalitions of the angry. It is only the hatred of the United States that could ever get Sufi Salafists to go with Shia radicals, and even then occasionally intramural firefights break out, which back in the 80s when insurgents were good guys, I was supporting the Afghans. One of the problems is keeping the Afghan groups from killing each other and keeping focused on killing Russians. That's a bit of a problem. We will see more of that. So there is no unifying cause. Islamism is a great inoculation against jihadism, but don't think that solves the problem, because we're getting to these smaller and smaller entities of people where a very small group like the Red Brigades, the German gangs that were prevalent in the 70s but relatively harmless because they only had pistols and explosives, are now going to be very, very dangerous entities. And we've got to rethink how we're going to deal with those. We've got to do it before it happens, or the knee-jerk reaction is going to be a Patriot Act really on steroids, where we're going to destroy our own freedoms in an effort to protect ourselves from very small groups.
And with that, we have to leave it. Congresswoman Tauscher is going to come straight on, I believe. And okay. Thanks very much.
We're going to keep rolling along, exercise a little tactical flexibility here, and we're going to postpone lunch. Ellen Tauscher is here, and I know everyone wants to hear from her. She has to leave before too long, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce her, and we'll hear from her now, and we will have lunch around 1. Ellen is a great friend of PPI and me personally, and someone I've been really happy to collaborate with on the cause of progressive modernization for many, many years now. She's a kind of quintessential Reform Democrat from a suburban district in California, and is a leader in the House of Representatives on so many issues as one of the co-chairs of the NDC. But she's also, in recent years, emerged as one of our party's most credible voices on national security. She is on the House Armed Services Committee, where she chairs the subcommittee on strategic forces, and has had some really thoughtful things to say about the future of nuclear deterrence, the balance between nuclear and conventional force structure in American national security strategy, about missile defense, and I gather also she is in the thick of this battle over the U.S.-India nuclear deal, which is, I think, very important. She also is one of, frankly, one of the few members of Congress who will take the time to cultivate relations with her counterparts overseas, and I really appreciate this. We get a lot of foreign visitors who come to PPI, parliamentarians, representatives of center-left parties, and they're always trying to talk to their compatriots here, and it's hard to get members of Congress for all the obvious reasons, but Ellen Tauscher will devote time into building international relationships. She's a real, true internationalist, and particularly active with our European friends. She chairs the Future Security and Defense Capabilities Committee of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and has given deep thought to the NATO's future, among other things. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to Congresswoman Ellen Tauscher.
Thank you, Will. Sorry to be the thing between you and lunch. So I will be, you're between me and an airplane, so I will be hopefully as interesting but brief as I can be, and perhaps we'll have some time for some questions. And I want to thank Will very much for his leadership at the PPI, and a big thanks to Jim for organizing this conference and showing that we as progressives have a very strong and smart approach to protecting our country, to national security, that we are patriots, and I want to thank you all for being here. It's really rewarding to be in a room with so many people that care about these issues and are working to take our country in a new direction. I just returned last Monday night in time for 6:30 votes. I was leading a congressional delegation to Afghanistan and Pakistan. We also stopped on our way over there at Aviano, where, as you know, we have a large NATO base, and we came back through Vienna. There was one day when I had breakfast in Kabul, a snack in Islamabad, and dinner in Vienna, and it was quite the long day, but my pilots kept reminding me that they're the ones that needed the sleep, not me. And we had a very interesting trip. Obviously, we were in Afghanistan and Pakistan at a very crucial time. When we were in those countries, we met with the Prime Minister of Pakistan, we met with the President of Afghanistan, we met with the military leadership in both countries, and, you know, we met with our military leadership too. I consider these to be two of the biggest security challenges of our time. You can look at Pakistan as a struggling state with resurgent terrorist organizations, the Taliban regrouping, certainly the seam, the ungoverned territory between Pakistan, which is an armed nuclear state, where the government only controls about 65% of its territory, and the country is also operating without signing the Non-Proliferation Treaty. This is one of the most volatile areas in the world. People look at Afghanistan and say, why is it important? And if all you have to do is look at the map. Afghanistan does not have much in natural resources. It's not a petro-state. It is certainly not a state that is rich in any other thing other than it has good people. Too many of them are illiterate, about 70%. So it doesn't have a lot to comport itself when it comes to the normal look of trade and resources and assets. But it is strategically the most fundamentally important place in the world. Someone is going to control the area of Afghanistan, and it has happened for generations. The question is it going to be people friendly to the Afghan people, friendly to their aspirations for democracy, friendly to their hope of being able to control their own borders, to be able to live in peace and prosperity, to be able to finally perhaps have roads without IEDs or big holes in them, to have an economy that's something other than poppies, to be able to aspire as people choose to do, at the same time that they keep their tribal traditions. Are they going to find friends that are going to help them come from way back in the past, the 20th century, into the 21st century, and join the world economy, or are they going to be preyed upon? And they have been, unfortunately, preyed upon for far too long. There are lots of places that are preyed upon. Why is Afghanistan important? Because it borders Iran, China, and Pakistan. And obviously it is in the environment very close to Russia. So it is a place that is very strategically important, and it is, of course, as we are now one day past the anniversary of September 11th, it is the strategic piece of land that historically has been used by others as a platform to congregate, to rejuvenate, to refinance, to resource, to recruit bad guys, and that is where the September 11th attacks were launched from. When we were in Vienna on Monday, we visited with Director General of the Atomic Energy Commission Agency, Mohammad Arbaladeh, to talk about many issues, including Iran and North Korea. The India deal did come up. I'm a strong opponent of the India deal, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But I just wanted to bring you up to date on the kind of travel that I've had, because it does inform my positions on some things. It certainly puts me in a position to say, when I was there last week, which is one of my colleagues and members of Congress' favorite thing to say. So when I was there last week, I decided that it would be important for me to be able to stand up and talk about why it's important we stabilize Afghanistan and Pakistan so they're no longer breeding grounds for the Taliban and al-Qaeda, and so that they can actually become members of the world community, and also that we need to galvanize many, many voices in order to work together to redefine the global effort to combat the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Being a Democrat, you're not going to be surprised that my dismay after 8 years of the Bush administration is, among many things, their bashing of arms control treaties and failing to lead on nonproliferation. And I think that's why Washington is poised for change. With the coming election of Barack Obama as president, we would move closer to a day when we once again can put a progressive vision on proliferation into practice, a vision that smartly sees the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction as a problem with multiple, not strictly military, solutions. A progressive solution puts the stewardship of our arsenal, nonproliferation programs, and the international arms control regime into one coherent strategy that better protects the American people. As the chairman of the Strategic Forces Subcommittee of the House Armed Services Committee, I've spent the last 2 years working to rationalize our nuclear complex, strengthen our stockpile stewardship programs, beef up security at the nuclear labs, and ensure that our nonproliferation programs have the support and money they deserve. Today, I'll address today's nuclear challenges and progressive ideas to meet them. Like many of you, I have long worried that our government does not have a clear understanding of the proliferation threats we face. The new president's first task in January should be to understand the true nature of proliferation. The Bush administration has done a very poor job of understanding the capabilities of terrorist groups and identifying the challenge posed by breakout nuclear powers. We cannot ignore groups like al-Qaeda who aim to acquire nuclear weapons, but we can miscalculate if we confuse intent with current capability. Al-Qaeda may want nuclear weapons, but likely does not have them, at least not yet. So that is why it is important for us to spend time determining the full extent of AQ-CON's nuclear black market across Southeast Asia and the Middle East. And we need to have the intelligence capabilities to detect the assembly of nuclear weapons by a terrorist group. Any comprehensive threat assessment must also take a close look at the international demand for nuclear power, which can create proliferation problems. The demand for nuclear power is growing exponentially and understandably. The IAEA projects that at least 60 more nuclear power plants will come online over the next 15 years, for a total of over 500 power plants worldwide. The United Nations warns that of the 60 countries that currently operate or are constructing reactors, at least 40, that's 40, have infrastructure to build nuclear weapons on relatively short notice. For nations willing to break the rules, the legal pursuit of nuclear energy can be a backdoor to developing illegal weapons capabilities. While we should not prevent countries from using nuclear power, the next president's threat assessment must be able to identify when it may be turning into a weapons program. Once the next president and Congress have a better understanding of these threats, it's critical that we find the best solutions to meet them. Our resources are finite, and part of the answer has to be strengthening existing international norms and, where necessary, inventing a new framework to manage and contain the threat of further proliferation. After 8 years of kicking treaties in the teeth, it is time that the United States recommit itself to arms control regimes that have served and secured our interests for so long. But recommitting need not mean embracing old tools in their current state. The high road for the Obama administration will be taking the best achievements of previous administrations, strengthening them, and exploring new policies like vigorous interventions to remove loose nuclear material. We must build on the successes of the past, whether they are binding treaties like the Non-Proliferation Treaty, multilateral regimes like the Nuclear Suppliers Group, international bodies like the IAEA, or a series of export controls and sanctions. A top goal for the new administration should be to ensure that the International Nuclear Club expands to include every country that has nuclear weapons, whether they have acknowledged them formally or not. This club then should include India, Pakistan, and Israel. It's the only way we are assured the owners of weapons, know-how, and materials are following the same rules, or frankly, any rules at all. The Bush administration's decision to give India, which is not a signatory of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the benefits of nuclear trade without any of the responsibilities was short-sighted and may encourage an arms race in South Asia. Other countries that may want to draw into the NPT in the future will now see no incentive whatsoever to do so, undermining our security interests. India, Pakistan, and Israel must be brought into the nuclear club and asked to adopt serious non-proliferation commitments. New concepts like coercive inspections or expanded threat reduction have a place alongside the existing arms control mechanisms in our toolbox. And the highly partisan debate witnessed in the Senate in 1999 should not be the end of the comprehensive test ban treaty story. The Senate must take up and ratify this treaty. There is also something Congress can do in the meantime to bolster international nonproliferation efforts. The CTBT organization is building and operating an amazing monitoring system that provides the international community with the ability to detect nuclear tests. When I was in Vienna just last week, I had an opportunity to visit and see exactly what the CTBT organization is doing, and it is a phenomenal sense of sensors. It is very much mirrored on the tsunami warning system, but it is much bigger and much more effective, and it is really a benchmark for what we need to be sure that whether it's rogue states or terrorist groups that choose to do any kind of testing, that we would know immediately where it was and be able to deal with the after effects of it. The system provides the multilateral validation that is vital in assessing events like the October 2006 nuclear test conducted by North Korea. It is equally vital that the United States and Russia negotiate a legally binding replacement to START, which is scheduled to expire at the end of next year. Despite current tensions between both countries, we still need to work with Russia to reduce our arsenals. As the United States and Russia reduce the number of deployed nuclear weapons in the spirit of the Moscow Treaty, these rules become more and more crucial. These rules create the confidence on which mutual deterrence relies. The United States must also lead a multilateral push to strengthen the International Atomic Energy Agency. The IAEA has seen the demands placed on it grow dramatically, but has had no real growth in its budget for several years. Modest investments in this area will pay substantial dividends for global nuclear security. After engaging our allies on international norms, we must also ensure that we have the most effective missile shield to protect our allies and ourselves. There are some Republicans who cling to Ronald Reagan's notion of Star Wars as sacred. They are wrong. And there are also some in our party who cling to their Reagan-era objections. They're wrong too. The House voted in 1999 to, I quote, deploy as soon as technologically possible an effective national missile defense system capable of defending the territory of the United States against limited ballistic missile attack. I voted for that. It passed. I have been working to achieve that, authorizing only what makes sense and cutting what doesn't. All told, the Democratic-led Congress authorized all but $1.5 billion of the Bush administration's over $21 billion request over the last 2 years. There has been a lot of tension lately on the U.S.-Poland agreement to base long-range missile defense inceptors there. Let me be clear. The way the Bush administration rolled out its proposal last year was just plain awful. They went bilaterally. They went outside of NATO. They misinformed people as to exactly the capabilities of the defense system. They let Russian saber rattling create a little bit of tension among the former Warsaw Pact countries. And then when we demanded that they change course, they began to. But by then it was almost too late. What is clear is that we need a system that focuses first on existing threats. For 8 years, the Bush administration has asked Congress to fund unproven science projects to create a layered missile defense system from literally the ground in Alaska to outer space. Moreover, the only plan the Bush administration has for Europe's security is against long-range missiles, a threat that has not yet materialized. But the Bush administration's lousy start with Poland doesn't have to mean our lousy result. Democrats are committed to working with our NATO allies to defend against the threat posed by short, medium, and long-range ballistic missiles, including the growing threat from Iran. And we are going to do it with a system that is sufficiently tested, designed to counter the real threats we face, and fully integrated with NATO. Senator Obama has backed the approach I put forward on European missile defense. I look forward to once again having a president who understands that America's strength comes not just from having the greatest military in the world, but from also having the indivisibility of alliance security. However, we can finally get it right in Poland and still miss the big picture here at home. We need to revamp the bureaucracy in Washington. A bipartisan report from the Partnership for Secure America made clear this week that our government is so disorganized it gets failing grades on addressing proliferation. Multiple agencies have an alphabet soup of offices and programs with responsibilities for various facets of proliferation. While our nation's nonproliferation programs all have had successes, they are not guided by an overall plan or someone with real authority. Because of this lack of high-level attention and leadership, some programs have either lapsed or been burdened with unrelated restrictions. For example, the Nuclear Cities program, which helped find alternative employment for Russian weapons scientists, was killed off by George W. Bush's first Secretary of Energy. That's why I championed a concept which Speaker Pelosi ultimately included in H.R. 1 that we voted on and passed the first couple of days that we were in office in January of '07. H.R. 1 said that Democrats' first priority when we gained the majority was to put an Office of Nonproliferation in the White House. The director is given full budget authority over all nonproliferation programs and is tasked with designing and implementing a strategic plan to address weapons of mass destruction. Makes sense, right? That's what the House thought. That's what the Senate thought, too. And that's what President Bush signed into law. But more than a year later, President Bush has yet to name a director. I know that President Obama would not be so distracted as to make the same mistake. Beyond all the steps that I have laid out to make our nonproliferation programs more coherent, our nuclear policy deserves a thorough public debate. I have long been committed to pushing our strategic and nuclear weapons policies out of the Cold War paradigms and into a new century. That's why I helped establish an independent bipartisan commission headed by former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry and Jim Schlesinger to examine U.S. strategic posture, paying close attention to our nuclear weapons policy. I believe this commission can help frame the discussion about the role nuclear weapons should play in our evolving notion of deterrence. How the United States manages and maintains our nuclear arsenal directly impacts how credible we can be when pressing for global nonproliferation. We have committed under Article 6 of the Nonproliferation Treaty to work in good faith toward nuclear disarmament, but we must also sustain a minimum deterrent for a foreseeable future. So how do we craft a nuclear weapons strategy that meets this challenge? The most recent Nuclear Posture Review is almost 6 years old. Its call for a new triad promised to de-emphasize nuclear weapons, but that promise was undermined by its call for new types of nuclear weapons. And its endorsement of preemptive nuclear strikes is terrifying. In this context, we find ourselves at a critical juncture in our strategic posture. The human capital and physical infrastructure we rely on to keep our nuclear weapons safe, secure, and reliable is aging. And nuclear weapons experts tell us that in the coming years, the life extension programs currently used to maintain our legacy weapons will no longer be cost-effective. From reorganizing the bureaucracy to developing a nuclear posture review that's more robust than it is earth-penetrating, President Obama will have a full plate when it comes to correcting the past 8 years and developing a nuclear policy our country needs and its global security dictates. As we look to answer these significant questions about our arsenal and the most effective ways to combat weapons of mass destruction, I look forward to working with all of you to make sure that we have the right choices and the right opportunities for the American people. I am happy to answer any kind of questions you have. This is pretty dense stuff, I know. It's pretty late in the day, and I'm sure you're all pretty hungry. But I really appreciate the chance to be here, Will. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them. Okay, I have a question. What are you all doing here? Where are you from?
Local Virginia?
Yeah? And are you a supporter of PPI?
Yeah, great. National security.
Great. What do you think of the India deal?
What do you think?
Finally, a question. I think the India deal is a dangerous deal for the United States. I think that if we stipulate very clearly that as one of the few democracies in a dangerous region, we find India to be a close friend and someone with whom we have many common values and certainly a strong and building relationship. But in an effort to get a friend closer, one shouldn't turn oneself into a pretzel. And you shouldn't bend over backwards if you're trying to figure out how to deal with proliferation on one side and allow a friend to have a new supply of uranium that could potentially be diverted very easily to build more nuclear weapons, especially when you consider that both India and Pakistan tested weapons, never signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and have suffered sanctions for that for many years. So I think that the Bush administration's intentions were good intentions. Like a lot of things they've done, I spent 14 years on Wall Street. I've seen money-chasing deals, and I've seen the deals go crazy because there's too much money-chasing deals, and people are making deals for all the wrong reason. I think this is a deal that was made for the wrong reason. The Indians made it very clear that they would not sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which should be number one on our list of asks. Number two, would not promise to test, not to test. We have to make sure that they don't test. And number three, they already have a number of civil and military reactors. What they're out of is uranium. And what this deal gives them is uranium. What they got in the deal was to declare a number of their reactors military reactors, which effectively put them behind a fence that no one gets to look at. So they get a fresh supply of uranium, no promise not to test, the ability to make more weapons. Who thinks that's a good idea, even for a friend? I would tell you that a friend is not a good friend if they ask you to do things that are an out-of-body experience, which effectively is what we have. So I will work hard with some of my colleagues to make sure that if we have a vote on this, that we offer amendments that try to make the deal better. It will be a deal in the end the Indians will not accept. That's fine with me. I think that under President Obama we can get a better deal for everybody, a deal that brings us closer to India, but not one that allows India to be either a proliferator, a tester, or a builder of new weapons without any accountability whatsoever. Yes, ma'am.
Pakistan, particularly the new government, and how you might view future military assistance versus economic assistance?
That's a great question. I think the most important takeaway of the Pakistan trip, it's very clear that you've got Prime Minister Jalani in a strong parliamentary system. When we were in Kabul for 2 days on Saturday, Benazir Bhutto's widower, Mr. Zardari, was elected president. We went in on Sunday, and he was sworn in on Tuesday. We also met with General Kiani, which was very unusual, and we also met with General Kidway, who's in charge of the nuclear weapons. The most important takeaway of Pakistan is they're 45 days away from financial default. Yikes. There's a lot of things happening. Lots of them are very interesting, and some of them not so good. They only control about 65% of their territories. As you know, our previous policy of hot pursuit, which was effectively if U.S. forces, even our soft forces, engaged near the Afghan-Pakistan border, we would be on the Afghan side if there was a hot pursuit, and we would go. But clearly that policy has changed. It's now come out in the press. President Bush has authorized incursions and attacks using mostly special forces and drones, predators, and we've had a number of attacks over the last 14 so days, and that's destabilizing our relationship with the Pakistani government. But on the other hand, we can't allow them to be a haven, and we can't allow them to not control their own territory. There are certain demands in the civilized world that we as progressives have to stand up for. And one is that states need to control their territories. Not in a bad way, not in a way that puts people down, but there has to be a measure of responsibility that every government has to assume, and that is at a minimum that they control their territories. And Pakistan, as you know, can't. But they have bigger problems domestically. They can only deliver power to Karachi, which is the Silicon Valley of their country, for 5 hours a day. They're 45 days from financial default. So there are some underpinning things that are have-to-haves that almost eclipse these other issues that are happening. My concern, of course, I think everybody's should be because of the history of Pakistan, would be a military coup. We don't see any sign of that. There's strong relationships being developed between the Gilani government and the military, but they do have weapons of mass destruction. They do have nuclear weapons, and it, of course, is important for us to understand what the C2 for that is and who has it and how they're managed and what kind of gates and guards they have and all of that stuff. Their financial situation puts all of that in jeopardy. So what I came back and suggested was that we start to look at all levers of American power, as Democrats would do, and look at the soft power issues and what kind of aid package can we put together to underpin the Pakistani government and the Pakistani people so that they don't go into default, so they can begin to work out some of these basic issues that you have to have a building economy, to have people, stay there. They've got a very big movement of people inside the country. They've got probably 250,000 IDPs just running around the country, trying to find havens, staying with relatives, either because they're in the Northwest Territories, or they're in the Fatah, or they're in Waziristan, or they're just trying to find power. So Pakistan is the most dangerous place in the world right now. And I think that we're working hard with the government to make sure that we understand exactly what to do. One of our bigger problems is that we're not very popular over there. So that is a problem. So we're using some of our European allies and friends as interlocutors and trying to get, you saw Gordon Brown yesterday doing a good job for us. But we need more of that. And we need a strategic plan on exactly what we need to do to make sure that they don't go into default, that they can begin to stabilize their economy, stabilize the internally displaced people, and try to get things back on track so that they can deal with the big issues of their own security. Yes, sir.
Congresswoman T.X. Hammes, an independent. I was very pleased to hear the depth of discussion on Pakistan, but I'm a little confused when you say that Afghanistan is the most critical strategic area when all of your arguments just outlined why Pakistan is so much more important than Afghanistan.
You can't talk about one without talking about the other. They are completely twinned. They're important for different reasons. Clearly, Afghanistan, as I said, has very little to commend itself other than the fact that it has freedom-loving people that deserve to be able to have self-determination. It has no assets, it has no resources, but what it has is a famously geographically important place. And it has been used as a platform before, and that is why the Taliban is so interested in trying to maintain itself there. It has grown, once again, the largest poppy crop. It's a narco state. But you cannot talk about Afghanistan without talking about Pakistan. They are completely in one argument for different reasons. Pakistan, of course, has nuclear weapons. It is moderately more developed and certainly has more assets and certainly has a population that is marginally more literate, but it is obviously in a different place. But the two of them have to be taken as a context, and they have to be taken together. And they have different issues, clearly. specifically their governments and their posture toward us. The Pakistani posture toward us is very much negative, as opposed to the Afghan posture toward us, which is moderately negative. Yes?
You just mentioned that you'd like to see countries like, India, Pakistan, and Israel within the framework of the NPT. Could you elaborate on that a little bit? How is that going to happen exactly? Is there going to be a new category? Are these countries going to be recognized as approved nuclear powers?
Well, I grew up in New Jersey where they filmed The Sopranos, and I represent California, so I have a kind of a worldview of big markets and little markets and influence. And from my point of view, is that the Non-Proliferation Treaty worked until it didn't. And certainly India and Pakistan and Israel are exemplars of how it hasn't worked. We need to have freedom-loving people around the world need to know that countries and populations possessing weapons of mass destruction, specifically nuclear weapons, are living within the confines of accountability and transparency and some sense that there is responsibility. That's why the NPT has been popular. Unfortunately, it's been undermined. Now, how do you get people that have chosen to live outside the NPT in the NPT? Well, we've been waving at them for a long time, asking them to come in, and they haven't. I suggest we just move the fence and say that either through UN or other international bodies or a reiteration of the NPT that we no longer can sustain in a world that is so interconnected and where proliferation is such an issue, especially when some of these countries are in such volatile areas, we can no longer sustain their or tolerate their decision to not play within the rules, and that the world community now says that they're in. And let them tell us they're not. Once they tell us they're not, then we're not confused about people's motives, are we? And we look at Iran and others. We look at Iran and North Korea, who clearly have programs that are beyond anybody's sense that they are quasi-civilian, quasi-commercial, that they are real weapons programs. So if somebody has a better idea, I'm willing to hear it, but until someone does, I'm willing to say I stand up for saying that anybody's got them is in.
The same problems as the India nuclear deal in terms of, you're moving the bar again, so you're undermining the regime in another aspect.
Well, we're not saying that we're going to degrade the requirements of the NPT nations by bringing these countries that haven't signed on in. We're saying that if you have them, that the world community believes that these are your minimum responsibilities. And if you decide that you're not going to play that game, then we're not going to be very tolerant of trading with you and having regular relationships with you, because we're going to consider you to be irresponsible and dangerous. We do that all the time. I mean, there are kids that I just don't, because I know their parents or I watch the way they drive, I don't want my kid in their car. I just say, you're not driving with so-and-so. And I get to say that. And this is very similar. This is a very small world. It continues to shrink. It has a lot of volatility and lots of danger. Lots of people crave and are very, very ambitious to have these weapons. Know-how has swirled around the world. Pakistan specifically has A.Q. Khan, who is under house arrest. He's never been deposed or debriefed by the world community as to what his network did. So we have no idea what's going on. That kind of nonsense cannot be sustained by freedom-loving people who believe that Africa, for example, should probably have a lot of civilian nuclear power, but it needs to be in a closed cycle. We need to control material. We need material banking. But you also need to have a hammer, and the hammer is the IAEA and intrusive inspections that say, you need to know that we're going to be holding you responsible for keeping things secure, for not letting know-how go swirling around, no on the internet, no trading people, no day spas for terrorism. This is the minimum requirement. And that's just my little way of thinking of how to rationalize it. But somebody else could have a better idea. So far, we've had not a lot of other ideas. So I'll try mine. Yes, sir.
With Pakistan, it seems like the greatest danger, or certainly one of them, is that members of Pakistan's military and intelligence services who sympathize with the Taliban or Al-Qaeda could transfer one or more nuclear weapons to those groups. And my question is, how confident are you in the security of the nuclear weapons in Pakistan? How much of a risk is it that some rogue elements of the military or intelligence services could steal or somehow transfer nuclear weapons? And are there things that the U.S. can do to reduce that risk?
That's a great question. Part of my mission on the trip was to make clear to the leaders in Pakistan that I met that there was a confidence-building exercise that needed to be implemented so that the normal questions that people have, because the risks go up exponentially about Pakistan versus Afghanistan. That's the difference between the two. They are completely in the same context, they are completely the same environment, they are completely indistinguishable, except that Pakistan ups the ante because it's got weapons of mass destruction and nuclear weapons. So the question really is, how do we deal with what has been an effort by the Pakistani governments, the last one and this one, to assure the American government, DOE, NNSA, and state, that they've got everything locked up and buttoned up, at the same time that they really won't tell us the details. When you see the increased volatility and the stabilizing environment that they live in. And that's the point that I made to both General Kiani and to former General Kidwai, who is the head of their nuclear program, that we needed to have a sense of confidence building. I don't expect, nor will they, completely open the kimono and tell us exactly how they do things and compare it to the way we do things or the way the French does it. But my sense is that there has to be a much larger effort. The easiest thing for them to do would be to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And I mentioned to our ambassador, maybe we should take a run at that again. Once again, to our point, we have an international regime that has worked except when it hasn't. And we can either say, well, the rest of us, the 100 and some odd that have lived inside the NPT, don't matter, or the 5 or 6 that are outside, stay outside the fence. And I just say move the fence. And I think you need to have a big effort inside of first world countries and others to say, we're going to be very careful about how we start to let you turn the lights on and how you get power, inexpensive power in your countries, which would be nuclear power and others, obviously, if we don't trust you to be able to not enrich. And how are you going to do that? Well, you're going to have a stronger NPT. The Bush administration was so ineffective in the NPT and believes in no treaties basically whatsoever that we had an NPT review in New York at the UN 4 years ago and they didn't even send anybody. I mean, they could have sent a junior person. They didn't send anybody. We have an NPT review coming up in 2010. Hopefully an Obama administration will have the Secretary of State there, and we will have a comprehensive plan to deal with the outliers of the NPT that will strengthen the NPT and will give freedom-loving people around the world that want access to nuclear civilian power a way to get it that basically gives people confidence that whether they buy a French reactor or whoever's reactor, that it's not going to be used for enrichment. That's the only way we can move forward.
I'm getting the anxious signs from
okay.
staff that they're playing the cash. So let me ask everybody to join me.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ellen Tauscher, for that very comprehensive tour d'horizon of nuclear strategy. Now it's time for lunch. Long delay. Please go help yourself and come back. We will resume in about 45 minutes, and I hope you will come back because we have a terrific roster of speakers this afternoon with Ash Carter and Jim Goldgeier and Ken Pollack. And and Bruce Hoffman to talk about the hard cases the next president's going to face, and Tammy Schultz is going to moderate. So please get some lunch and come back, and we'll resume in 45 minutes.
U.S. Representative Ellen Tauscher also spoke at this forum. She chairs the House Armed Services Subcommittee on Strategic Forces. This hour-and-a-half forum was part of a conference hosted by the Progressive Policy Institute.
Get started.